Welcome to Deep Dive. Welcome. We're thrilled to have you here. Let's dive in and grow together.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Remember Sai Deepak's India, Bharat, and Pakistan? You know, the constitutional journey of a sandwich civilization.
Yeah.
We already went through part 1, India, that is Bharat.
Right.
And now it's time for part 2.
Yes.
And Deepak doesn't mess around. Part 2 is a big one.
It is.
It takes up a good chunk of this 144-page book.
Yeah, we're not going to cover it all in one go.
No way.
Yeah.
So to really dive deep, we're splitting it into 5, count them 5, deep dives.
5, that's right.
That's right.
And today, we're starting with the introduction and the appendix to part 2.
Perfect.
You know, really setting the stage,
Yeah.
understanding the key players,
Yes.
the key events that kind of set the stage for the creation of Pakistan.
Exactly. So we're talking about big names like Sir Syed Ahmed Khan,
Yes.
movements like Islamic revivalism,
Of course.
even the partition of Bengal in 1905. This
Absolutely.
deep dive is like getting a sneak peek behind the curtain before the main show.
It is. It's gathering all the puzzle pieces before we start putting them together.
Yeah, I like that.
And Deepak introduces 2 really crucial concepts right off the bat, Darul Islam and Darul Harb.
Okay, so for those of us who aren't, Islamic scholars,
Right.
what do those terms even mean? I mean, I know they're important, but I need a little refresher.
Yeah, so Darul Islam translates to territory of Islam, where Islamic law and principles prevail.
Okay.
It's the ideal, right, for a lot of Muslims during this period.
Right.
On the other hand, you have Darul Harb, which means territory of war,
Okay.
and typically refers to non-Islamic lands.
Got it.
And these concepts were central to how many Muslims viewed the world, especially under British rule.
So how does Deepak connect these ideas to the story of Pakistan?
Well, he argues that these contrasting concepts deeply influenced Muslim identity and political thought in India.
Okay.
It's like a lens through which we can understand, their anxieties and aspirations.
Okay.
Imagine being a Muslim in British India, surrounded by what you consider Darul Harb. It creates this sense of urgency,
Yeah.
this need to define your own space, your own identity.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Uh-huh.
And speaking of anxieties, Deepak really emphasizes the tension between the All India Muslim League
Yeah,
and the Indian National Congress.
absolutely.
Right.
The Muslim League was deeply concerned about becoming a minority under potential Hindu majority rule,
Right.
particularly as the Indian National Congress was gaining momentum.
Okay.
This fear echoed the arguments of Sir Syed Ahmed Khan decades earlier.
Ah, Sir Syed,
Yeah.
the champion of Western education for Muslims and the founder of the Aligarh movement.
Yes,
He's like a rock star in this story.
he is, and he was incredibly influential.
He was.
But his ideas were also controversial.
Oh, okay.
While he believed that Muslims needed to embrace Western education
Right.
to thrive in the modern world.
Okay.
Some criticized him for being too accommodating to the British.
So even back then, there were different perspectives within the Muslim community about how to navigate their situation. Absolutely. It wasn't just this monolithic us versus them mentality.
Exactly.
Okay.
Deepak's very careful to show the diversity of thought within the Muslim community.
Interesting.
Some, like Sir Syed, believed in working within the existing framework to advance Muslim interests.
Okay.
Others advocated for a more radical separation, a return to Islamic principles as the foundation for governance.
So a real internal debate.
Yes, absolutely.
And this internal debate is crucial to understanding how the idea of a separate Muslim nation eventually gained traction, right?
It wasn't just a simple case of Muslims wanting their own country
Right.
because they were different from Hindus.
Okay.
It was a culmination of various factors, including these internal discussions about identity, political strategy, and religious revivalism.
Okay, let's talk about this wave of Islamic revivalism
Yes.
that was sweeping through India in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Yeah.
What was driving that?
Well, imagine the context. You have British colonialism,
Okay.
the decline of traditional Islamic power centers, and a sense of cultural and religious threat.
Mm-hmm.
All these factors led to a resurgence of Islamic thought and practice,
Right.
with movements like the Deobandi and Al-Hadith emerging.
So these movements weren't just about, religious rituals.
No.
They were grappling with the political and social realities of the time, weren't they?
Absolutely. They were engaged in debates about Muslim identity under British rule,
Right.
challenging colonial policies,
Okay.
and advocating for a more prominent role for Islam in public life.
And this connects back to Darul Islam, right?
Basically.
That idea of creating a space where Islamic principles could truly flourish.
Exactly. For many Muslims, these revivalist movements weren't just about preserving tradition.
Okay.
They were about creating a future where Islam could thrive,
Right.
free from the constraints of British rule and what they saw as the encroaching influence of other religions and cultures.
It's interesting how even seemingly abstract theological concepts like Darul Islam could have such a powerful impact on real-world political movements.
Exactly. Deepak's highlighting how ideas have consequences.
Yeah.
And these theological concepts, when combined with the anxieties and aspirations of the time,
Right.
became powerful motivators for political action.
So we have Sir Syed promoting Western education, these Islamic revivalist movements pushing for a more prominent role for Islam, and the Muslim League starting to voice concerns about Hindu dominance.
Yes,
It sounds like the stage is being set for some major political drama.
it certainly is.
And remember, this is all happening against the backdrop of British colonialism.
Of course.
The British are playing a key role in shaping this landscape, sometimes intentionally,
Yeah,
sometimes unintentionally.
absolutely.
You mentioned the partition of Bengal in 1905.
Yeah.
That seems like a pretty big deal in this story.
It was a turning point. You know, the British decided to divide the Bengal province
Okay.
for administrative reasons, but it backfired spectacularly.
And I'm guessing it had the opposite effect, further fueling both nationalist and separatist sentiments.
Exactly. The partition sparked widespread protests, boycotts of British goods.
Wow.
It gave a huge boost to the Muslim League,
No.
which had just been formed a year earlier.
So what was intended as a bureaucratic move ended up having massive political consequences.
Yes.
So we have this complex mix of historical anxieties, religious revivalism,
Yeah.
and British policies all swirling around.
It's a lot.
It seems like Deepak is suggesting that we can't understand the creation of Pakistan without taking all of these factors into account.
Absolutely. He's painting a nuanced picture showing us that this wasn't a simple linear process.
Right.
It was a messy, complicated affair.
Yeah.
With multiple threads weaving together to create a tapestry of events that ultimately led to the partition.
Speaking of messy and complicated, let's talk more about Sir Syed.
Okay.
Deepak really dives into his life and work, doesn't he?
He does. He shows us that Sir Syed was a complex figure, a man of his time grappling with some very challenging questions.
Yeah.
He was deeply committed to the advancement of Muslims in India,
Okay.
but his approach was often pragmatic, even controversial.
You mentioned earlier that some people criticized him for being too cozy with the British.
Right.
What did they want him to do differently?
Well, his critics, many of whom were inspired by the revivalist movements we discussed earlier, felt that Sir Syed was too focused on working within the system, on appeasing the British.
Okay.
They wanted a more assertive stance,
Right.
more explicit rejection of colonial influence.
So even within the Muslim community, there wasn't a consensus on how to deal with the British
Not at all.
or with the larger question of Hindu-Muslim relations.
No, and Deepak doesn't shy away from that.
Yeah.
He shows us the internal debates, the disagreements, the different visions for the future.
Right.
He helps us understand that the story of Pakistan's creation wasn't just about, Muslims versus Hindus, but also about Muslims grappling with their own internal differences.
It's like we're looking at a mosaic
Yes.
with all these different pieces coming together to form a larger, more complex picture.
That's a great way to put it, and Deepak's the master mosaic artist here,
Yeah.
carefully arranging these pieces to reveal the intricacies of this historical moment.
And this is just the introduction and appendix.
I know, right?
I'm really curious to see how he dives into specific historical periods and events in the rest of the book.
Me too. We've laid the groundwork, established the context.
Right.
And now it's time to delve into the nitty-gritty of how these ideas and events played out on the ground.
Buckle up, everybody.
Buckle up. It's going to be a fascinating ride.
I'm ready. But before we move on, I want to make sure our listeners are keeping up.
Yes.
What's the one key takeaway they should have from this introductory deep dive?
The key takeaway here is that the creation of Pakistan wasn't a sudden event, a knee-jerk reaction to some immediate crisis.
Okay.
It was the culmination of a long and complex process.
Right.
Shaped by religious anxieties, political maneuvering,
Yeah.
internal debates within the Muslim community, and the ever-present influence of British colonialism.
So it wasn't just about drawing lines on a map. It was about drawing lines in the minds of people.
Yes.
Lines that had been etched over decades, even centuries.
Exactly. And those lines, those divisions, those anxieties are what Deepak is helping us unpack and understand.
Yeah.
He's not giving us easy answers, but he's giving us the tools to ask the right questions.
And that's what makes this deep dive so valuable.
Yes.
We're not just passively absorbing information.
Right.
We're actively engaging with history, challenging our assumptions, and gaining a deeper understanding of the forces that shape the world we live in today.
Precisely. And that's what makes this journey so exciting.
Yeah.
We're explorers,
Yeah.
venturing into uncharted territory,
That's right.
ready to uncover the hidden stories and the forgotten voices that shaped this pivotal moment in history.
Okay, I'm officially hooked. So, what's coming up in our next deep dive?
In our next deep dive, we'll be tackling Section 1 of Part 2,
Oh,
covering the period from 1740 to 1898.
boy.
This is where we really start to see the seeds of Pakistan being sown.
Presto.
We'll be exploring the rise of key figures, the evolution of political thought, and the growing tension between different visions for India's future.
Sounds like a fascinating period. But before we get there,
Okay.
let's leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question to ponder.
All right.
Deepak mentions that the demand for transferring legislative and administrative control from the British to Indians created a real dilemma for the Muslim community.
Yes.
How might this prospect of self-rule, of potentially being governed by a Hindu majority, have influenced their perception of the Indian National Congress? Did it fuel the emergence of separatist politics?
It's a question that cuts to the heart of the anxieties and aspirations that shaped this period.
It does.
And I'm eager to see how Deepak explores it in the chapters to come.
Me too. So, until our next deep dive, keep exploring the book, and we'll pick up the conversation where we left off.
Sounds good.
See you then.
See you then. It's fascinating how Deepak frames this whole discussion about self-rule, transferring power from the British to Indians.
Oh, yeah.
He says it actually intensified anxieties within the Muslim community.
That's interesting. I mean, you'd think they'd be thrilled to get the British off their backs.
Right.
Why would the idea of self-rule cause them to worry?
Well, think about it. If the British were no longer in control,
Yeah.
who would be?
Right.
The answer, as many Muslims saw it,
Yep.
was a Hindu majority.
Oh, okay.
And that prospect was, to put it mildly, unsettling.
Okay, I'm starting to see the dilemma.
Yeah.
They wanted independence,
Yeah.
but they also feared what might come after.
Exactly.
Right?
And Deepak suggests that this fear, this sense of vulnerability,
Yeah.
played a significant role in shaping Muslim political thought.
Okay.
It pushed some towards more radical solutions, like the idea of a separate Muslim state.
So they were caught between a rock and a hard place.
They were
Or, on the one hand, they had British colonialism, which they obviously resented.
obvious.
But on the other hand, they had the potential for Hindu dominance,
Yeah.
which they found equally troubling.
Exactly. And this is where figures like Sir Syed become so intriguing.
Right.
He was trying to find a way to navigate this complex landscape to secure Muslim rights and interests within a united India.
But as we discussed earlier, not everyone agreed with his approach.
They do.
Many felt that he was too accommodating to the British,
Right.
too willing to compromise.
Too willing to compromise, and those voices advocating for a more assertive,
Yeah.
even separatist approach
Right.
gained momentum as we got closer to the 20th century.
Yeah, it's like the pressure cooker was slowly building up,
Exactly.
and the events of the early 1900s just turned up the heat.
Turned up the heat.
Okay, let's go back to Islamic revivalism for a moment. You mentioned the Deobandi and Ali Hadith movements.
Yes.
How did their views on Islamic law and governance influence the political landscape?
Well, these movements emphasize the importance of a distinctly Islamic way of life, one that wasn't diluted by outside influences.
Right.
And they challenge the idea that Islam could just be relegated to the private sphere,
Okay.
arguing that it should have a central role in shaping public life and governance.
So it wasn't just about personal piety.
It wasn't.
It was about creating a society that reflected their understanding of Islamic principles.
Exactly.
And I imagine that vision clashed with the more secular, pluralistic vision
It did.
that some within the Indian National Congress were advocating.
Yeah,
I could see how that clash of visions would create tension,
of course.
especially as the question of independence for Britain became more pressing.
Absolutely. It's like two trains heading towards each other on the same track.
Oh, wow.
And the collision, when it came, was bound to be dramatic.
Okay, let's talk about Shah Wali Yus Alawi. His theory of two kingdoms sounds pretty radical for the 18th century.
It was a powerful idea,
Right.
and it resonated deeply with those who felt that Islam was under threat.
Okay.
Remember, Dalai was writing at a time when the Mughal Empire was in decline,
Right.
Islamic power was waning.
So his theory was a way of asserting the supremacy of Islam,
Yes.
even in the face of political and military setbacks.
Exactly. He argued that true sovereignty lies with God,
Okay.
not with earthly rulers.
Right.
And this meant that Muslims weren't obligated to submit to non-Islamic authorities.
Wow, that's a pretty bold statement for that era.
It was a bold statement.
It was.
And it's important to note that Dalai wasn't explicitly calling for the creation of Pakistan,
Okay.
but his ideas, his emphasis on the distinct nature of Islamic sovereignty,
Right.
provided a framework for later thinkers who did advocate for a separate Muslim state.
It's like he planted the seeds,
Yeah,
even if he didn't live to see the tree fully grow.
that's a great analogy. And those seeds were nurtured by the events that followed.
Mhm.
Events like the partition of Bengal, which further fueled the sense of Muslim separateness and anxiety.
Speaking of the partition,
Yeah,
Deepak really emphasizes its unintended consequences, doesn't he?
he does.
It's almost like the British inadvertently created the very conditions that led to the partition of India itself, just a few decades later.
It's a classic example of how seemingly minor decisions can have massive ripple effects.
Yeah.
You know, the British probably thought they were just tinkering with administrative boundaries.
Right, right.
They had no idea they were setting in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the creation of a new nation.
It's a reminder that history is full of surprises, isn't it?
It is.
And that sometimes the most significant events are the ones that no one sees coming.
Absolutely. And it's also a reminder that we need to be careful about how we interpret the past.
Okay.
You know, it's easy to look back and say, well, of course the partition was inevitable.
Yeah.
But it wasn't. It was the result of a complex interplay of factors, choices, and unintended consequences.
And Deepak is helping us understand those choices,
Yes.
those factors,
He is-
and those consequences.
He is. He's not just telling us what happened.
Right.
He's helping us understand why it happened.
And that's what makes this deep dive so rewarding.
It is.
We're not just passively absorbing information.
Right.
We're actively engaging with history, grappling with its complexities,
Right.
challenging our own assumptions.
Absolutely.
Okay, before we get too far ahead of ourselves,
Okay.
let's bring it back to the book.
All right.
We're still in the Introduction and Appendix.
We are, and Deepak is doing a masterful job of laying the groundwork
Yeah.
for the deeper dive into specific historical periods that's coming up next.
Right.
He's introduced us to the key players, the major themes, and the ideological currents that shaped the trajectory of India, Bharat, and Pakistan.
It's like we've been given a map and a compass. And now we're ready to set off on an expedition into the uncharted territory of history.
And trust me, this is an expedition you won't want to miss.
I believe you.
We're going to encounter fascinating characters, dramatic events, and ideas that continue to shape the world today.
So what's the one thing our listeners should keep in mind as we move forward in our exploration?
Remember, this is not a simple story of good guys and bad guys.
Okay.
It's a story of people grappling with incredibly complex challenges, anxieties, and aspirations.
Yeah.
And Deepak is inviting us to see the world through their eyes,
Right.
to understand their motivations and to appreciate the nuances of this historical moment.
And to remember that history is not just something that happened in the past.
Right.
It's something that continues to shape our present and our future.
Precisely. And by understanding the past, we can gain a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world we live in.
Well said.
Thank you.
Now, I'm really curious to see what Deepak has in store for us in the next section. Are you ready to move on?
Absolutely. Let's dive into section 1, where we'll explore the period from 1740 to 1898.
Right.
This is where we see the foundations of Muslim political consciousness in India really start to solidify.
Sounds like we're about to enter a pivotal era, but before we do, let's leave our listeners with another thought-provoking question.
Okay.
Deepak mentions that the All India Mohammedan Educational Conference,
Right.
a platform for Muslim leaders to voice their concerns,
Yes.
was a key development in this period.
Yes.
Why might this conference have been so significant?
That's a great question. It highlights the growing sense of Muslim identity
Okay.
and the increasing desire for a platform to articulate their unique needs and aspirations.
Right.
It was a space where they could come together, debate strategies, and forge a path forward in a rapidly changing world.
It sounds like we're about to witness the birth of a movement.
We are. And that movement, with all its complexities and contradictions,
Right.
will ultimately lead to the creation of Pakistan.
We've covered a lot of ground in this first deep dive into Deepak's book.
We have, yeah. From anxieties about potential Hindu majority rule to, the complexities of Islamic revivalism.
Yeah.
It's clear that the creation of Pakistan, it wasn't a simple event.
No. It was the culmination of a long and intricate process shaped by so many factors.
So many factors,
Yeah.
exactly. And Deepak's introduction has given us this powerful lens to view, this historical period. The concepts of Darul Islam and Darul Harb,
Right.
the tension between the Muslim League and the Congress, the impact of figures like Sir Syed Ahmed Khan
Right.
and Shah Waliullah Dilawi.
Yeah.
These are all essential pieces of the puzzle.
And it's a puzzle with a lot of pieces.
It is.
But I'm starting to see how they fit together.
That's the beauty of Deepak's work.
Yeah.
He doesn't shy away from the complexities.
Right.
He embraces them.
Yeah.
Showing us the nuances, the competing perspectives, the messy reality of history.
It's a far cry from the simplified narratives we often encounter.
It is.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Okay.
what's a one key takeaway you hope our listeners will walk away with?
I think the most important takeaway is that the creation of Pakistan wasn't inevitable.
Yes.
It wasn't simply a matter of destiny or religious differences.
Right.
It was the result of specific historical circumstances, political decisions, and anxieties and aspirations of real people.
And those anxieties and aspirations, they're often intertwined, creating a very complex web of motivations.
Exactly. And that's what makes this history so fascinating to explore. It challenges us to move beyond simplistic explanations.
Right.
And grapple with the messy reality of human experience.
Deepak's book is an invitation to think critically,
It is.
to question assumptions, and to engage with the past in a meaningful way.
Absolutely. It's an invitation I hope our listeners will accept.
So what's next on our journey through Sai Deepak's book?
Well, in our next deep dive, we're going to be tackling Section 1 of Part 2,
Okay.
covering the period from 1740 to 1898.
Perfect.
This is where we really start to see the groundwork being laid for the Pakistan movement.
Okay.
We'll explore the rise of key figures, the evolution of political thought,
Right.
and that growing tension between different visions for India's future.
It sounds like we're about to enter a pivotal era.
We are.
But before we get there, let's leave our listeners with one final thought to ponder.
Okay.
Deepak highlights the dilemma faced by the Muslim community as the demand for self-rule gained momentum.
Yes.
On one hand, they yearned for freedom from British colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, they feared the potential consequences of a Hindu-majority government.
Right.
How did this dilemma shape their political choices?
Yeah.
How did it contribute to the emergence of separatist politics?
These are all questions we'll continue to explore as we delve deeper into Deepak's analysis.
It's a reminder that history is not this distant, abstract thing.
No.
It's a story about real people facing real challenges,
Absolutely.
making difficult choices,
They did.
and shaping the world we live in today.
Yes.
And as we continue our deep dive into Sai Deepak's India, Bharat, and Pakistan, we'll uncover more of those stories,
Yes.
gaining a deeper understanding of this pivotal period in history.
It is.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.